Welcome to Declassified Deep Dive, where unredacted files reveal hidden truths. Let's uncover the secrets. I'm your host, Raj, and each week we explore a new secret deep dive.
Okay, get this. We're going deep on declassified CIA projects. And not just any projects, we're talking about psychic phenomena.
Oh, yeah. The really weird stuff.
Remote viewing, psychoenergetics.
The whole 9 yards.
You sent over a crazy mix for this deep dive.
I did.
We've got actual CIA documents, transcripts from the infographic show and the Sean Ryan show.
Oh, and don't forget about the handbook on remote viewing techniques.
Right, from a former CIA, well, I guess you'd call him an operative.
Exactly.
So where do we even start with all this?
Well, I think the best place to begin is with the historical context. You know, we're talking about the Cold War here.
Peak paranoia between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Right. Both sides are digging into anything that might give them an edge.
Even if it sounded a little, well, out there.
Exactly. And the infographic show claims that the Soviets actually had a 60 million ruble budget for psychic research back in 1970.
1970, wow.
Yeah. And get this, just 5 years later,
Yeah.
it jumped to 300 million. So the CIA sees that and thinks, we can't let them win the psychic arms race. That's where Project Stargate comes in.
Project Stargate, it sounds like a movie.
Right.
So what were they actually doing under this program?
Well, they were exploring all sorts of psychic phenomena, but the real focus was on remote viewing.
Hold on, remote viewing, what is that?
Imagine being able to spy on enemy installations or locate hidden weapons.
Wait, you mean like with your mind?
Exactly.
Mhm.
Or even gaining intel on what foreign leaders are thinking, all without leaving a room.
So they were trying to train like actual psychic spies?
That seems to be the case, and these declassified documents really show how deep they went with this.
This is wild.
Yeah, and they were particularly interested in psychoenergetics.
Psycho what?
Psychoenergetics, basically the idea that your mind can directly affect the physical world.
Okay, no, that's just getting too sci-fi for me.
Yeah, it gets pretty wild, but how did they even begin testing this?
Well, you mentioned earlier some early experiments at the Stanford Research Institute, right?
Exactly. Stanford was like a hotbed for this kind of research. They were working with figures like Ingo Swann.
Ingo Swann, wasn't he the one who claimed to have, like, remotely viewed Jupiter?
Yeah, before Voyager even got there.
That's crazy.
And then there was Uri Geller, the spoon-bending guy.
Oh, yeah, I remember him.
Both the infographic show and mega projects on YouTube, they both highlight those two as key figures in those early days.
So out of all the people involved in this, there's one name that keeps coming up.
Oh, I know what you're going to say, Joe McMoneagle.
Yeah, you sent over a transcript of his interview on the Sean Ryan show, and this guy seems like the real deal.
He's a fascinating character, for sure.
His story is pretty incredible.
Yeah, starts with a pretty tough upbringing in Miami, then the service in Vietnam, and then he has this near-death experience.
Whoa, wait a minute, a near-death experience? What happened?
It was during a hurricane. I think he was in the Bahamas, just after Vietnam.
Okay.
And he describes this feeling of being detached from his body, like he was watching everything from above.
That's intense.
Yeah. It's a common thread in those near-death accounts, that sense of being outside yourself.
So how does this guy go from surviving a hurricane to becoming, what did you call him, Remote Viewer 001?
Yeah, Remote Viewer 001.
That's a pretty cool title.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Well, it sounds crazy, but he sort of stumbled into it.
Really?
Yeah, he was stationed in Europe working in intelligence, and they approached him for this special project.
On psychic functioning?
Yeah, basically they showed him a room full of information and said, see what you can make of this.
You're kidding.
No,
So he wasn't even like actively seeking this out.
it doesn't seem so.
So what happened next? Was he any good at it?
Well, according to his interview, he showed a natural talent for it right from the start.
Really?
They started him off with these simple tests describing places someone else had visited,
Okay.
and then they gradually ramped up the difficulty.
And that's where it gets really interesting, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because McMoneagle describes these like incredible missions they tasked him with.
Like that one where he located a crashed Soviet bomber in Africa.
And he even described like a rust stain on a nearby building.
Right. Incredible detail.
It's insane. So they were using a psychic to like find downed planes.
It seems so.
What else did he do?
Well, he claims to have pinpointed a Soviet submarine with, like, incredible accuracy, tracked a spy, and described the guy's activities down to the specific equipment he was using.
Hold up. They were using a psychic to track down spies.
Apparently so. He even helped rescue hostages by providing details like spiderwebs in trees which turned out to be tripwires for explosives.
This is some serious James Bond level stuff.
It is, right.
But hold on, how much of this can we actually believe? Did they ever, like, independently verify any of his claims?
That's the million-dollar question. McMoneagle was part of this team within Project Stargate, and his sessions were monitored and analyzed.
Okay.
But the details of how they verified his information are still largely classified.
So it's kind of a black box.
A bit of a mystery.
But even if we take his claims with a grain of salt, it's still super intriguing.
I agree.
What about the techniques they were using for this remote viewing? Did McMoneagle ever actually describe his process?
He touches on it in his interview, and he goes into more detail in his book, Remote Viewing Secrets.
Okay.
And one of the things he emphasizes is the importance of skepticism, not just for those observing.
But for the remote viewer themselves.
Exactly. He says you can't let your emotions or any preconceived notions influence what you're perceiving.
So you're saying a good remote viewer needs to be, like, almost detached, objective.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, especially if you're dealing with really sensitive information.
Absolutely.
McMoneagle talks about quieting your mind, blocking out distractions, and being completely open to whatever information comes through.
It's almost like meditation or something.
In a way, yeah, he compares it to learning to bowl. You can't just force it.
You have to kind of develop the skill and trust the process.
Right, it's a very specific skill set.
Did he talk about any specific techniques or protocols they used?
He's a big advocate for protocols and methodology.
Makes sense.
He actually says, and I'm quoting here, remote viewing is a discipline, a science, and a technique containing certain principles that cannot and should not be diluted.
So he's serious about this stuff. He's not just some,
Right, he's not some woo-woo psychic.
Exactly. It's interesting that he's trying to bring, like, a scientific approach to something that most people would consider totally paranormal.
He's walking that line between the mystical and the scientific, trying to bridge that gap between subjective psychic experiences and, objective data.
And speaking of data, you mentioned a study that looked at a possible connection between sidereal time and ESP.
I did.
So can you break that down for us? What is sidereal time, and how does it relate to psychic abilities?
Well, sidereal time is basically a timekeeping system that's based on the Earth's rotation relative to the stars,
Okay.
as opposed to the sun.
Got it.
So it's a way to measure the Earth's orientation in space, basically.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that this study found a correlation between the success rate of these remote viewing experiments and the sidereal time when they were conducted.
So they're suggesting that the Earth's position, like, relative to the stars, might actually influence psychic abilities.
It's a pretty wild idea, right?
That's mind-blowing.
But the study itself doesn't offer any definitive answers.
Of course not. But it does suggest there might be more to this than we currently understand.
Exactly.
So we've got this mix of, like, anecdotal evidence, historical context, and even a little bit of scientific research that hints at something beyond our current understanding of the world.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
But the scientific community isn't exactly lining up to, endorse this stuff.
That's true. It's understandable why.
I mean, these are pretty extraordinary claims.
They are.
And the scientific method demands extraordinary evidence.
Exactly.
We need more than just, like, anecdotes and correlations.
You do.
And there's always the risk of, like, confirmation bias, especially when you're dealing with subjective experiences.
Right. Remember Ray Hyman?
Yeah, the psychologist who was skeptical of Uri Geller.
Yeah, he thought a lot of it was just trickery.
And to be fair, even McMoneagle acknowledges the importance of skepticism.
He does.
He's not saying we should just blindly accept everything we see or hear.
Absolutely not.
He's actually challenging us to be, critical thinkers.
He is, and that kind of adds to his credibility, I think.
I agree. It suggests he's actually interested in understanding the truth, even if it means questioning his own beliefs and experiences.
Exactly.
So it seems like we've got a lot to unpack here. We've got this Cold War context, the CIA's fascination with psychic phenomena.
The whole thing with Joe McMoneagle.
Right, and a whole bunch of unanswered questions.
And this is just the beginning.
Oh, I know. We're just getting started.
We still need to dive deeper into McMoneagle's insights on remote viewing, explore those ethical quandaries you mentioned,
Oh, yeah.
and maybe even uncover some more of those, shall we say, bizarre CIA projects you hinted at.
Oh, believe me, you are not going to believe what the CIA tried to pull off with the cat. But that's a story for part 2.
Can't wait. Welcome back to our deep dive into the CIA and all things psychic. Last time we left off talking about Joe McMoneagle and his pretty crazy stories about remote viewing.
It's really hard to wrap your head around, like, spying on the Soviets with your mind.
I know, right?
And we touched on some of those ethical questions surrounding these programs, especially in light of things like MKUltra. So how does someone like McMoneagle, who seems so focused on, protocols and methodology,
Yeah.
how does he reconcile that with the darker side of these programs?
It's a good question, and McMoneagle actually addresses it in the interview.
Oh, he does.
He does. He argues that Project Stargate was ultimately shut down because the CIA was just terrified of another MKUltra-level scandal.
Really?
They didn't want Congress breathing down their necks.
So he's suggesting that they were willing to, sacrifice a program they potentially believed in just to avoid bad press?
Pretty much.
That's cynical.
It is, but it also makes you wonder why they even bothered with these projects in the first place if they were so afraid of the blowback.
Right.
Was it really all about, the psychic arms race with the Soviets?
Yeah.
Or did they genuinely believe they could weaponize psychic abilities?
I mean, McMoneagle's stories are pretty compelling.
They are.
He claims to have found this downed Soviet bomber, identified a submarine, even helped rescue hostages.
Right.
These aren't just vague predictions. He gave specific details.
Yeah.
So how do we explain that if it wasn't, some form of psychic ability?
Well, it's tempting to dismiss it all as just coincidence or exaggeration, right?
Sure.
But McMoneagle does go into a lot of detail.
He does.
And some of it has apparently been corroborated by other sources.
Okay, so the question is, how much of this can we attribute to, genuine psychic ability versus, intuition, subconscious perception, or even just good luck?
Exactly, and there's always that risk of confirmation bias.
Oh, absolutely.
We tend to focus on the hits and ignore the misses, especially when it comes to something as, nebulous as psychic phenomena.
It would be interesting to see, the full data set.
Oh, yeah.
Not just the successful missions.
Right, the whole picture.
But that's why I think McMoneagle's emphasis on those protocols and methodology is so interesting.
It is. He's trying to bring some level of scientific rigor to a field that's often been, shrouded in mystery and speculation.
And we talk about that study that found a correlation between sidereal time and, the success rate of remote viewing experiments.
Right.
That seems like an attempt to bring in some, hard data.
It does.
But it also raises even more questions.
Yeah, how could the Earth's position relative to the stars possibly influence psychic abilities?
It's a pretty wild idea.
It is, and the study itself doesn't really provide any explanations.
Of course not, just the correlation.
Right, just a statistical correlation.
So it could be that there's some kind of subtle energy field that fluctuates with the Earth's orientation.
Yeah.
Or, I don't know, maybe it's something to do with the gravitational pull of the stars.
Who knows?
We just don't know.
It's a mystery.
Sounds like we're pretty deep in the realm of speculation here.
We are.
But even if we can't explain how it works, the fact that there's even a hint of a connection, it's pretty mind-blowing.
It definitely challenges our current understanding of physics and consciousness.
Yeah, it's there's this whole layer of reality that we're just, starting to glimpse.
Right.
But even if we accept that there might be something to this, the question of how to study it scientifically remains a huge obstacle.
It does.
You can't just put psychic abilities under a microscope.
Exactly. It's all about subjective experiences and interpretations.
Yeah.
And those are incredibly difficult to measure objectively.
And then there's the whole issue of replication.
Right. Can you reproduce these results under controlled conditions?
Yeah.
That's the gold standard of scientific proof.
Right. And even if you could, design the perfect experiment, there's still that issue of human psychology.
Oh, absolutely.
Belief can be a powerful thing.
It can.
And it can easily influence, both the participants and the researchers in these kinds of studies.
Which is why McMoneagle really stresses that skepticism.
Yeah.
He's not saying we should blindly believe everything we hear about this stuff.
Right.
He's saying approach it with a critical mind. Be open to the possibility, but be aware of the pitfalls.
So it sounds like the jury is still out on whether remote viewing is, a real phenomenon.
It is.
We've got some tantalizing clues, some compelling stories, a few hints of scientific evidence, but we're still a long way from, definitive proof.
I think that's fair to say.
But even if we never fully understand the mechanics of it, the fact that the CIA invested so much time and resources into exploring these abilities,
It does make you think.
it's like they were acknowledging that there's something there,
Yeah.
something beyond our current grasp.
Right. And McMoneagle's work, with his focus on, protocols and methodology,
Yeah.
seems like a step in the right direction, an attempt to kind of bridge that gap between, science and the paranormal.
I think so.
So we've talked a lot about remote viewing,
We have.
but you mentioned earlier that McMoneagle also discusses something called remote influencing in his book.
Oh, yeah.
That sounds even more like mind-boggling.
It does, right. Imagine being able to influence events or people at a distance using just your mind.
So like make someone win the lottery or, I don't know, trip and fall just by thinking about it.
Well, McMoneagle is very careful to point out that it's a complex phenomenon to study and even harder to prove.
Okay.
He uses an example of this medical experiment
Okay.
where they divide patients into a target group and a control group.
Right.
And the target group is subjected to remote influencing while the control group isn't.
Uh.
And they want to see if the target group shows, any measurable improvement compared to the control
So
group.
like a classic double-blind study. Yeah. But there's a catch.
I figured there was.
McMoneagle poses this question. What if the person who initially divided those patients into groups was subconsciously using precognition to select the patients who were, like, more likely to improve anyway?
So it becomes a question of whether the remote influencing is actually working
Yeah.
or if it's just like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly.
That's really tricky.
It is, and it highlights the challenges of studying these phenomena.
Yeah,
There's so many variables,
I bet.
and it's just really hard to isolate the specific effects of remote influencing.
Like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape.
Exactly. So McMoneagle really stresses the importance of those rigorous protocols, those double-blind experiments, the statistical analysis.
Yeah.
You have to be incredibly meticulous to even have a chance of separating, the signal from the noise.
So remote influencing is a fascinating concept,
It is.
but it seems like it's even further out on the fringes of, scientific plausibility than remote viewing.
That's probably fair to say.
But it's important to remember that what seems impossible today
Right.
might become commonplace tomorrow.
It's true.
Our understanding of the universe is constantly evolving.
Always changing.
All right, so we've explored the world of remote viewing
We have.
and touched upon this even more mind-bending concept of remote influencing.
Right.
But now I'm dying to hear about those bizarre CIA projects you hinted at earlier.
Ah, yes.
What's the story with this spy cat?
Project Acoustic Kitty.
You're kidding, right? They actually tried to train cats to be spies.
I'm not kidding. In the middle of the Cold War, the CIA thought, what's more stealthy and inconspicuous than a cat?
Okay, I'm all ears.
So Project Acoustic Kitty was born, this top-secret mission to transform a feline friend into a furry little eavesdropping machine.
I mean, how did they even think they could pull this off?
Well, the idea was to surgically implant listening devices in a cat
Wow.
and then train it to infiltrate, like, Soviet embassies or other sensitive locations.
Seriously?
Imagine a cat, slinking through the shadows, picking up snippets of top-secret conversations.
It does sound like something out of a spy spoof.
A little bit, right.
But seriously, did they really believe they could, control a cat like that?
Well, that's the thing. Cats are not exactly known for their obedience.
Their willingness to, follow orders.
Right. I can't even get my cat to come when I call him for dinner.
Exactly.
But the CIA, undeterred, pressed on.
They did.
Yeah, they poured millions of dollars into developing miniature electronics, perfecting surgical techniques, even creating special training programs for their feline operative.
Okay, so how did the training go?
Well, from what we know, they used a combination of audio cues and food rewards
Okay.
to try and direct the cat towards its target.
I bet that was a challenge.
It was. According to the transcripts, the cat was easily distracted,
Really?
often wandered off in search of food or other, diversions.
So what happened on its first official mission?
Well, the grand debut of the spy cat did not go as planned. The poor creature was tasked with eavesdropping on two men seated on a park bench.
Okay.
And while crossing the street, it was struck by a car, and, well, that was the end of that.
Oh, no. That's awful.
It is a rather sad and ironic end to an already pretty outlandish tale.
So Project Acoustic Kitty, despite all the time and money and effort,
Yeah.
was ultimately deemed a failure.
It was. It turns out even the CIA couldn't control the, shall we say, capricious nature of cats.
Or fate, for that matter.
Right.
But, in a way, it's almost a relief that it didn't work out.
How so?
Well, can you imagine the ethical implications if they had actually managed to create, a mind-controlled spy cat?
That's a good point. It raises all sorts of questions about animal welfare and, potential for abuse.
Right. It's probably for the best that Project Acoustic Kitty remains a, bizarre footnote in the history of espionage.
I think so, too.
Okay, so we've had our fun with spy cats.
We have.
But let's circle back to the bigger picture here.
Okay.
We've been exploring the CIA's ventures into psychic phenomena.
And it's clear they were, looking for any advantage they could get during the Cold War.
Right, but what about the individuals involved?
Yeah, like Joe McMoneagle.
Right. Do you think they genuinely believed in these abilities?
I think it's probably a mix of things,
Yeah.
There was definitely the pressure of the Cold War.
The fear of falling behind.
Exactly. But based on McMoneagle's, writings and interviews,
Yeah.
I also think there was a genuine fascination with the potential of the human mind.
I agree.
He talks about remote viewing not just as a weapon, but as this tool for, understanding the world,
Right.
solving problems, exploring history, even potentially, glimpsing the future.
It's a pretty powerful idea.
It is, and that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
What if he's right?
What if?
What if there is this layer of reality that we're not fully tapping into?
Like a sixth sense.
Yeah, that allows us to perceive information beyond our, five senses. It's a mind-boggling concept. But as we've discussed, the scientific evidence is still pretty thin.
It is.
So how do we reconcile these extraordinary claims with, the lack of hard proof?
Right. I mean, we're dealing with these subjective experiences.
We are.
With phenomena that are notoriously difficult to, study and quantify.
Absolutely. And the stigma surrounding psychic phenomena makes it even harder to conduct rigorous research.
Who wants to be the scientist who studies ESP?
Right. You're opening yourself up to ridicule.
Exactly. But even McMoneagle emphasizes that importance of, skepticism and critical thinking.
He does.
He's not asking us to just blindly believe everything we hear.
Not at all.
He's challenging us to, explore the possibilities, to question our assumptions.
And maybe even push the boundaries of what we think we know about the world.
It definitely makes you think, so where do we go from here?
Well, I think the key is to continue to approach this with a balanced perspective. Open to the possibilities, but also grounded in critical thinking and a healthy dose of skepticism.
So we need, more research, more data, and more, I guess, open-minded exploration.
Exactly. And maybe a little less reliance on spy cats.
Definitely. Let's leave the espionage to the professionals.
Agreed.
And focus on the bigger questions.
Like, what is the nature of consciousness? What are the limits of human perception?
And what possibilities might we unlock if we, dare to explore the unknown?
That's what it's all about.
Well, this deep dive has been an incredible journey.
It has.
We've uncovered some fascinating history, explored mind-boggling concepts.
And laughed at the CIA's attempt to weaponize a cat.
It's a good reminder that the world is full of mysteries.
It is.
And there's always more to learn.
Always.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on this crazy journey exploring the CIA's, well, let's just say, their more unusual projects.
Their ventures into the world of psychic phenomena.
Exactly. From remote viewing to the whole M-Culture thing, it's been wild.
It has.
But you promised we'd end on a lighter note.
I did.
And I'm still trying to wrap my head around this Project Acoustic Kitty thing.
Yes, the spy cat.
You've got to be kidding me. They really tried to turn a cat into a spy.
They did, in the middle of the Cold War, no less.
So, how did this even come about?
Well, the CIA, they're thinking, what's more stealthy, more inconspicuous than a cat?
Okay, but a cat. Really?
I know, right? But Project Acoustic Kitty was born.
This top secret mission to turn a cat into, a furry little James Bond.
Basically, they wanted to surgically implant listening devices into a cat.
Surgically implant?
Yeah, and then train it to infiltrate, Soviet embassies or other sensitive locations.
So this cat's just going to stroll into the Kremlin and, start purring secrets into a microphone?
Well, that was the idea. The cat would just blend in. Nobody would suspect a thing.
Okay, but cats are notoriously, they do their own thing.
Exactly. They're not exactly known for following orders.
You can't just, train a cat to be a spy.
That's what most people would think. But the CIA, they were determined.
They really went through with this.
They did millions of dollars, miniature electronics, special training programs, the whole 9 yards.
So what did this training look like?
From what we know, they used a combination of audio cues and food rewards.
To get the cat to, go to certain locations.
Yeah, to try and direct it towards its target.
I bet that was a nightmare.
Apparently the cat was, easily distracted.
Shocker.
Often wandered off looking for food or, just doing cat things.
So what happened on its first mission?
Well, let's just say it didn't go as planned.
Oh, no.
The cat was supposed to eavesdrop on these two guys on a park bench.
Okay.
And while crossing the street, it got hit by a car.
Oh, no, that's terrible.
Yeah, not exactly the ending they were hoping for.
So, Project Acoustic Kitty, A multi-million-dollar failure.
Pretty much. They learned the hard way that even the CIA can't control the whims of a cat.
Or fate, I guess.
Right, but, maybe it's for the best.
I mean, a mind-controlled spy cat? That's kind of creepy.
It raises all sorts of ethical questions.
Definitely better left in the realm of, weird Cold War experiments.
Agreed. But let's shift gears a bit. We've talked a lot about the CIA's motivations.
Yeah, trying to stay ahead of the Soviets.
But what about the people involved, the actual remote viewers?
With McMoneagle.
Yeah, do you think they genuinely believed in this stuff?
I think so. I mean, there was the Cold War pressure.
Absolutely.
But McMoneagle, he seems to have a real fascination with the potential of the human mind.
He does. He talks about it as this untapped resource, a way to solve problems, explore history, even understand the universe.
It's a pretty profound concept.
It is, but it also raises some big questions.
Like, what if he's right?
What if there is this whole other level of perception that we're not aware of?
But the scientific evidence is still pretty shaky.
It is, and that's the challenge. These experiences are so subjective.
How do you measure that?
Exactly. It's hard to study, to quantify.
And there's still a lot of skepticism around this whole field.
There is. It's almost taboo in the scientific community.
But McMoneagle himself talks about the importance of skepticism.
He does. He's not saying we should just blindly accept everything.
He wants us to question, to explore, to push the boundaries of what we think we know.
And that's what makes this so fascinating.
It is. It's a reminder that we still have so much to learn about the world, about ourselves.
Absolutely.
This deep dive, it's been a wild ride.
It has.
Spy cats, psychic spies, mind-bending experiments. Who knew the CIA was so into the paranormal?
It's been an adventure, for sure.
Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive, but the conversation doesn't end here.
No, it doesn't.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and who knows, maybe you'll tap into your own sixth sense along the way.
Until next time.